Hey Trails Collective, Ian here. Today I am going to be weighing in on a shoe that I've been really looking forward to, or actually a series I've really been looking forward to for the past year and a half. It's the North Face VECTIV series. And today, or in this round, going to be talking about the North Face VECTIV Infinite.
'Cause I wanna be like the wind, I wanna run with you, we can be wolves, howling at the prey when move. I wanna be by your side when we light up the sky for the world to see. Run, 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 run with me.
So, what's this shoe all about? The VECTIV series. This is basically North Face's recommitment to really creating basically a good trail shoe. So historically, North Face has been an interesting entity in that they really haven't been able to make a trail shoe top tier or really come together as a full package. When I first got into the trail and ultra space maybe 20 or so years ago, around that time, I think, or sometime after, even some of their sponsored athletes in the trail ultra world, interestingly, weren't required to even wear or sport the North Face shoes when they were racing. I think it was just kind of widely known or agreed that they just really weren't making that great of shoes. So, for years, I think that's been the case, and that's just kind of been my, I guess, experience or forecast with North Face shoes specifically. So about a year and a half or so ago, I reached out to North Face, really interested in their Future Light fabric that they were weaving into a jacket that was about to hit the market. And I reached out, one, to test the jacket, and then two, see whether it was something we could potentially bring into the shop or open a North Face account. The rep at the time cued me into something larger that was taking shape within North Face, which was that recommitment to trail and footwear. So they gave me a little bit of a window into that, and I've been following along here in there over the past year and a half on that process and anxiously awaiting the shoes in hand. So what's it all about? North Face is basically redefining some of, well, I guess redefining their entire line based on really pushing ahead with current and pushing the boundary technology. They're entering the fray with a plate technology, and various models in the VECTIV series have varied composition plates and designs based on intended use. So let's take you through from the top down some of the pieces that I think really came together and work, and which ones I think where maybe their intent for design and fashion superseded actual function, which could use some improvement. All right, so actually let's start with some of the specs. So specs. Weight, men's average weight comes in at 10.8 ounces, which I believe should be for the men's 9. I don't have a full size run in here, so I can't really measure whether that's accurate weight or not. And in women's, 9.6 ounces. So fairly lightweight package there. A listed spec 25 to 19. What I actually get for the different component stack heights is the insole between 3.5 and 4 millimeters here, and we'll talk about the compositions here in a minute. The lasting of the shoe on the inside, which you might be able to see there a little bit in gray, is 2 millimeters. The plate, I'm guessing, based on the fin measurement, is around 2 millimeters. The midsole stack, I think, is around 18 millimeters in the heel, a little bit tougher for me to measure in the forefoot. The base outsole rubber, which is the strip between the midsole and the lugs, around 2 millimeters. Outsole lugs themselves, 4 millimeters. And that gives me a combined stack of 32 millimeters in the heel and 26 millimeters if the drop is truly 6 in the forefoot. Shoe weighs in at, or comes in at a price point of $169 on the Infinite, definitely on the upper end of the price tier. In some cases, I question the value or whether that's really justified. In the case of the Infinite, as we'll go through in some of the properties, I think it does make sense. So let's get into it. let's see, the upper. So the material that they're using in most of the upper is the matrix fabric. And this is a fabric that's woven with aramid fibers. One of the trade names for aramid is Kevlar. And for those of you who get an immediate association, you just know that Kevlar is a really durable material. So they're doing a great job of putting in a premium fabric into the upper, which should be fairly bomb-proof in durability. We have mentioned that upper in the, it's around here somewhere, the S-Lab Cross from Salomon in a prior review. They're also using a matrix fiber or fabric, and I found that to be pretty good so far in terms of durability, as well as a combination of flexibility and support. So I think that that is a good call, very premium fabric that they're using there. They have some rubberized, it could be thin layers of TPU overlays in over the vamp to provide some securement in off-camber surfaces. It has a rubberized, again, could be TPU toe guard that wraps around to meet the fins of the VECTIV plate, which we'll talk about here in a second. And then that feeds into an atraditional heel collar. So what they did here is they don't have an internal plastic plate. This is just a soft, flexible, kind of rubberized material. On the inside, they have basically two pads there, which would wrap around your Achilles. And then they have a collar that sits above that padding. Fairly slick design. The tongue itself also is really slick. It's thin. It has spot padding right over the top, and it really thins out and is notched for more flexibility to where it meets the ankle. Some of the early designs of footwear that started using that really thin tongue on the top ran into issues with people's basically instep or the top of their ankle getting abraded. So I think it's a good call to notch that out to provide a little bit more flexibility. Spot padding in the tongue there, for me, I feel like works pretty well. I don't really feel much pressure coming from the flat laces, which tend to lay over that pretty smoothly. And it has a really thin, soft gusset to the tongue, which twofold, helping to keep some of the debris out of the shoe if it does drop in there, and it does, which we'll get at in a second, as well as keeping or aiding to keep that tongue in place or from sliding. All right, so what we're getting here. So functionally, it's a thin, smooth package. I don't really get any hot spots. I don't get any pinches out of the overlays or the TPU, but some of the drawbacks. So in this rubberized toe guard, functionally does a good job of preventing abradement and also provides some lateral support for off-cambered surfaces. But what it, one of the downsides is once water gets into the shoe, and it does get into the shoe, it basically holds it like a pool. So one of the benefits to the matrix fabric, in addition to being really durable, is it's a hydrophobic material. So when you submerge the shoe and go through a creek crossing, you literally feel the water just drain right off the fabric. It really doesn't absorb or hold on to it. But that benefit is really negated by the lower design of the shoe, which is something that really should have come out in testing. This rubberized guard, which extends all the way around the shoe, doesn't have any perforations, which is really just a shortcoming in design. Other examples which use the rubberized toe guard have, such as the Topo Ultrafly Pro here, have very intentional perforations to allow water to push out of that vamp. In the case of the VECTIV Infinite, it's literally locked in once it's in. The insole, which is made of ortholite. Ortholite is widely used from shoe companies where it's a fairly durable, soft material. So it really, out of the box, feels good, adds another layer of cushion there, and it helps sell the shoe in terms of just the first feel. The downside to ortholite, which I've also mentioned in prior reviews of the Topo products as an example, which are using it, whether it be the Mountain Racer or the Ultra Venture Pro, is it also unfortunately acts as a sponge. So once water gets in there, it soaks up or right into that sponge-like material, and it just hangs on to it for, I don't know, a long time. And so what happens here is once the water comes through this matrix upper, it's constrained by the pool effect of the surrounding laminates, and then it sits and sponges in that insole. So it's a really conflicting feel where you feel the water drain right off of the upper, but then you're just kind of sloshing around in it inside the shoe. Definitely something that could have, I think, and in round 2, could get some very, I think, quick and easy improvements. Something to be aware of. Another shortcoming of the upper. The design in the rear foot or around the ankle is pretty slick. It's really soft with the pads. It's nice that they change up the traditional padded heel collar. But the downside is once debris gets down into the shoe, and it does, there's somewhat of a pocket, which I'll plug or weave in a clip in here of me digging out some of the snow on a recent test run from in that groove. Once any material drops in there, whether it be snow or debris, it's basically stuck. It goes down and rests right on that padded pocket, and then because of the collar, it can't get out. It's basically like a pocket. So that's something that, although this is a fairly slick design, I feel like it's one of those areas that they were probably pushing the boundaries of material design over actually the wear testing and feedback. Of all the thousands of hours that their sponsored and team athletes have put into the design and testing of the VECTIV series, I'm really surprised if they wouldn't have provided feedback on both of those, water retention as well as debris pocketing. And if they did provide the feedback, whether there's just a disconnect between athlete testing and the design and marketing team. All right, so let's move a layer down. The VECTIV plate. The VECTIV plate is a 3D plate in terms of the molding or design. The 3D molding or printing to it allows it to have, well, two-part functions. The tabs that float or rise up to meet the vamp on the upper do provide some lateral support for off-camber surfaces, but it also assists with the plate itself not packing out or flattening with use. Both of those things, I think, work pretty well. What is a shortcoming or could use improvement from my vantage point is that these tabs, particularly on the outside where they rise up over the vamp, on a fairly technical descent where my forefoot is pushing down into the front of the shoe, I get my fifth toe pushing out and basically meeting that plastic, or in this case, Pebax plate on the outside. It hasn't really caused any bruising or abradement, but I definitely feel it, and it makes me question over a ultra distance on a technical course whether that could present an issue to an individual with a wider forefoot, or in my case, just a kind of fat, stubby toe, thanks to my grandma. So that's definitely something that gives me pause. Again, it hasn't created much of an issue, I've just noticed it. The plate that they're using in the Infinite series is made of Pebax, and in their VECTIV series, they have their Flight, their VECTIV Flight, or Flight VECTIV, which is en route. I should get it in the next week or so, and I'm really anxious to test it. It uses a carbon plate with a slightly different design, really intended for max propulsion. The Pebax, or thermoplastic plate that the Infinite is using, is based on a bit more of a balanced design, and I think I do feel that underfoot. The rocker geometry, we'll talk about in a second, does aid in the propulsion, but the plate itself, or the foundation or chassis of the shoe, does feel pretty balanced. The Pebax material is 20% lighter than what's being used. I think it's a TPU plate in the next tier down in the VECTIV series. So I think that works pretty well. So the plate then sinks in with their midsole design, and which is, I've mentioned, a rocker geometry design. The material itself in the midsole is a two-part EVA. The upper portion, which is this black layer here, has a durometer of, if I remember right, 55. It's a bit firmer, which I think syncs with the stability of the plate design. And then the lower material, which you'll see here in white, and then it transitions to black in the heel, is a 45 durometer, which is just a little bit softer to add to that underfoot cushion feel, as well as the ability for it to conform to variable surfaces. I like the midsole material. I think it offers cushion. I have no problems with this EVA blend. I'm not finding myself really craving some sort of advanced proprietary material. I think it's a good blend of cushion and responsivity. Durability to EVA isn't spectacular, but I'm sure it'll do just fine with the protection of the plate on top of it. The rocker design, I was curious whether I was going to really feel or notice the rocker design. There are some brands that have used it historically. The Hoka, as an example, making kind of a chunky, blocky midsole work, use a degree of a dynamic platform or rocker, which I don't feel that much. So I was curious whether North Face, basically what their design was going to be like. And so I'm going to weave in a clip here of basically setting the Infinite down on a bench and sliding 2 papers in, one from each side. And basically, I was able to slide those papers in all the way up into basically 1.5 inches or 35 millimeter center fingers width in the shoe. And it came right up into meeting basically these 2 central lugs in the middle of the shoe. It's pretty crazy. And so right out of the box, you notice it. You put it on, you're like, whoa, yeah, there's the rocker. And I would hope that if you're finding your way into the shoe that you're really curious and excited to feel that design or geometry. And in this case, there's no hiding it. I think they've kind of nailed it in terms of being after the rocker design. There's no masking really what it's doing under the foot. Now, rocker designs. I'm not necessarily a fan of rocker geometry. I feel like the foot or our feet have evolved over thousands of years to basically allow us to move over variable terrain. There's a lot of structures in the foot that have to work together or come together for functional propulsion. One of or 2 of the prime structures in the foot, there would be a medial longitudinal arch and a lateral longitudinal arch. Both of those have to work in concert to basically allow the foot to unlock, absorb impact, and then tighten back up for a stable propulsion. When you look at the design and particularly where the fulcrum of this rocker design is, it basically comes as a inverse, basically mirror image of those, particularly the medial longitudinal arch. Whereas your arch is doing this, the plate's doing that. And so from my vantage point, it's just a completely unnatural design. In one of the early tests, I was running a section of forest, put my foot down on an otherwise unremarkable log, which probably came down right around there, which was behind the fulcrum of the rocker. And what my foot basically had to do, because the rocker or design was still going in this direction, it basically had to accommodate by rocking my heel and loading my Achilles this way, while at the same time it needed to flex and push up and over that log. And so what I first thought of was an On Running ad, which I'll also weave in here, which had just come across one of my social media streams, I think the week before. And what you'll see in the individual in that clip, I'm assuming was being asked or told to basically, well, go fast to make it look sporty in this advertisement. But what was actually happening was the individual was running with a pretty poor mechanic and having to overstride or land outside of her base of support. And what you'll see is she basically comes down here on her foot, her heel drops down while her body's going forward and then needs to propel forward. And so it's really in a dysfunctional gait pattern or strike pattern, which can be potentially injurious. When you put it on a trail and you're getting that potentially back-to-back or repeated motion, you're just setting yourself up or asking your lower leg to do 2 conflicting motions, which can, I think, cause some trauma or injury to some of the muscles down there. So I think it's a fairly risky design. With all that said, and not that I'm making the case for rocker geometry, I haven't really had any issues with it. It does feel really quite smooth right out of the box. I have gotten used to the feel, and it hasn't really caused any issues once I'm out there. All right, the Outsole. Outsole, their trademark term on it is surface control. It's a proprietary blend that they've used 40% plant or biomaterial in, and that's for the eco nature of once the outsole rubber degrades rather, or shaves off onto the trail, they're just giving it a little bit of help in the biodegradation into the soil. So I think that's a really classy move. In some cases, if it were to have inhibited the functional grippiness or tackiness of the outsole, I'd potentially question it. In this case, the outsole rubber is quite sticky. I'll weave into the written review a clip of one of the recent tests I did of comparing the top outsole rubbers on the market. And comparatively speaking, same day, same conditions, the surface control material they're using here held its own pretty well. It's probably second tier to the Innovate graphene or the VJ butyl rubber in terms of stickiness. Even the number 2, which really surprised me, is an Asics Fuji Trabuco Light up here. Really quite sticky material they're using in the outsole, but this probably comes in that next tier down along the lines or similar to the Salomon Contra-Grip TA. So it really works pretty well. It's a fairly soft rubber, so in just the 75 miles or so I have into the shoe, I've started shaving off that exterior lug. That's fairly typical for me in all shoes. I think the Innovate graphene up there is the only one that really held up without much abradement. It's just a much more durable, I think, compound. But it's fairly par for the course. If you're using it for straight trails, or you're not one to really break down outsole rubber really overly quickly, maybe just fine. The lug configuration, as I mentioned, 4mm lugs. They're using a butterfly shape to them, and I think it works really well for multi-directional stability. It's grabbing you side-to-side motions. If your foot happens to pitch, particularly on a descent, if you're riding one way or the other, it grips well. It'll claw back on ascents, and it's still fairly smooth on descents. I think it's a really nice design. It might be tough to see here, but there's a center line or groove in those butterfly lugs. And I believe, or I would think, that that's a groove for water passage over creek crossings. And so while it's tough to really feel that, in my experience, in knowing some of the testing they've done or companies have done, those channels do tend to work pretty well. So I've enjoyed the outsole rubber configuration, fairly versatile in terms of the lug design. So they are some of the, I think, really weighing in on what it gets right, what areas it could use improvement in. Who's it going to be appropriate for? Somebody who's really, I think, been following along with some of the plate battles from some of the shoe companies might be interested in really seeing what this is all about. North Face may be one of the first out of the gates to applying a plate in a trail model. Saucony has a pretty slick plated model in their Endorphin series releasing in the fall. It's not one that I'm permitted to release I do have a fairly quick and intro video already done on it, but I'm not allowed to, I think, release it for a few months. But it also is one that is making use of a carbon, and I'll be pretty anxious and curious to get that on my feet. But they are out of the gates fairly early. Questionable whether the plate design really makes as big a difference on variable terrain as it would on a linear road surface. But they're going after it, and I think it works with this package. The last is fairly straight. It has a decently wide midfoot gauge. The toe box, while not flared out like Topo or Ultra, I think still does a good job and provides adequate berth over the metatarsals and toes. So for somebody looking for a fairly lightweight, fast feeling, and just fun new tech product, the Vective series might be for sure one to check out. The price point is fairly high, but again, materials they're using with the plate design in here, which should increase the longevity of the midsole wear, and the matrix fiber, which should prove really durable long term, I think it does make sense. So North Face, welcome to the fray of actually creating, I think, pretty slick and worthy trail shoe designs, worthy of your stature in the outdoor space. I'll be excited to see the reviews of more people getting it on their feet, and I'll be even more excited if you pay attention to our reviews on ways that a version 2, when it's ready, could be improved upon. So we'll bring this into the Trails Collective and Finger Lakes Running Company store here in the spring, so look out for it, and let us know if you want to get a pair on your feet. If you're a size 11, stop into the shop. You can try on mine, give it a run, and then look for my Flight Vective review, which should be coming in the next few weeks after I get it in and do a comparison. All right, thanks so much for tuning in, and I will catch you next round. See ya!